Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second full-length podcast of Lashed to the Mast. Just some announcements before we go forward. I got a lot of feedback from you all, and it sounds like these longer formats are a little inconvenient to go through. So, what I decided to do is to split each podcast into three parts. So, the philosophy part, politics part, and economics part, and that way you can watch those 20-minute sections on your own by themselves if you want to, or you can watch two of them but not the other. If philosophy is too confusing for you, for example. Although I would recommend still trying to listen to the philosophy part, but yeah, so you can do whatever with those. And let's see, there's a second announcement that I had. Oh yes, so the second announcement I had is I'm going to be creating a link to um, hopefully a link to for you guys to comment on the videos and give your feedback. Unfortunately, the one I sent last week didn't work for some reason, but this I'll include this link in the Facebook post, in my Facebook post, um, as well as hopefully in the description. But I'm not sure if it'll work in the description, so we'll go from there. All right. Well, with the preliminaries out of the way, let's get into philosophy. All right. Um, yeah. So after looking at my at the previous podcast, I realized that I didn't really do full justice to Aristotle's conception of act and potency. So I'm gonna really slow down here and just take it go really step by step. And we're gonna be covering the same exact material that was actually less material than was covered in the first section, because I really want you guys to understand what's going on. So yeah, if it hopefully this will make it easier for people to understand. But yeah, and I think I'll keep like changing perspectives on these and throwing you guys curveballs and stuff like that, just to really reinforce your knowledge of it. And at the end of this philosophy section, there will be a 10-question quiz. So prep yourselves for that. I'll review everything in the recap that you need to know for the quiz, but definitely listen up to uh, the text, and you should be good to go for the quiz. Um, yeah, and also, yeah, don't be afraid if it's really hard to understand. The famous philosopher Avicenna, it took him 40 read-throughs of Aristotle before Aristotle's Metaphysics before he understood what Aristotle was saying. So this can be really tough to think like this, because we don't naturally think like this, but that doesn't mean you can't still try. Um, all right, so let's jump into the nitty-gritties here. So the first thing we'll do is start with a review of basic terms and people. Um, so if you recall, Parmenides and Zeno were the first metaphysicians and argued that since something can't come from nothing, there can only be one existence. So they basically thought that there was no difference between anything on Earth. Everything was just being, which is kind of mind-blowing. But um, yeah. So, metaphysics, if you recall, when I say Parmenides and Zeno were the first metaphysicians, you'll recall that metaphysics means the study of the supersensible, meaning the study of that which goes beyond what we can directly see, or alternatively, the science of being qua being, which means isolating the aspect of being aspect of a thing that is its existence and only focusing on that. Like for this goes back to the Taco Bell example that I mentioned in the first podcast. If you have a taco, you can judge the whole thing, but or you have the option of judging the whole thing, or you can just take out one ingredient and only look at that. And that's kind of what we're doing here. Is we're the everything around us is kind of like the taco, and we're trying to isolate being as a part of maybe the lettuce, or as a part of everything else, um, and see where it comes from, and what makes something be versus not be, and yeah, all of that fun stuff. Um, so yeah, going back, returning to Parmenides and Zeno, their position that that there was only one existence is known as static monism, where static refers to their denial of change, and monism refers to the fact that only one thing exists, namely being, as I said before. Uh, so to explain this further, let's actually introduce the concept of actuality, which refers to the part of the thing which exists or has its being. Um, so Parmenides and Zeno are trying to argue here that since only actuality exists, and remember going back to last episode, actuality just means something in the world that is existent right now. Since something, okay, so let me back up and redo the argument then. Parmenides and Zeno are trying to argue that since only actuality exists, and since something can't come from nothing, the only thing that could separate actual existing would be non actual existence would be non-existence. So there's either the thing is or it isn't. And if the thing is, the only way to distinguish it from something that is different from itself is through nothing, because that's the only thing that's different from being is not being, and not being doesn't exist. So you're just left with being, and under this view, and there's no way to distinguish anything between, or to distinguish, uh, uh, there's no way to like divide being into multiple different uh, entities, because it's just because that would require not being modifying it, which it can't. So it's a very, if you grant the premise that being only being exists, or if you grant the premise that it's only an option between being and non-being, it's actually logically coherent argument. But yeah, the starting premises are a little faulty there. Um, all right, so then Zeno, his Parmenides' student, attempted to prove all of this through two famous paradoxes. In the first one, called the Dichotomy Paradox, he argued against the possibility of change by noting that to travel from point A to point B would require traveling half the distance to point B, which in turn would require traveling half the distance to point B, and so on ad infinitum, uh, until infinity, making it impossible to even lift a foot off the ground, since lifting it up 1 inch would require lifting it up a half inch, and that in turn would require lifting up a fourth inch, and so on ad infinitum. Because of this, Zeno concluded that uh, travel and change must be impossible. Um, and then he has another paradox called the paradox of parts, which says that um, if we take a thing like a rock, um, it's infinitely divisible. Like you can cut it infinite number of ways. Um, so but it follows from that, if you can cut it infinitely a number of ways, then it follows that that thing and all other divisible things must be infinitely large, which is absurd. Therefore, Zeno argued that being cannot have parts. And let's go back over this again, because this might be a little confusing. But remember, for Parmenides and Zeno, there's being and there's non-being. Non-being doesn't exist, so there's just being. And what Zeno's saying is, if you look at the rock, if that is being that is infinitely divisible, um, all of those infinite ways of cutting it up have to exist somehow. If they don't exist, if they don't actually exist, then they don't exist at all, and it's not even a rock we're considering. But if they exist, then all of them have to exist, or none of them would exist. Because remember, we're working with the framework of existence and non-existence. So that's kind of what Zeno's paradox of parts is trying to say there. Um, so how do we get out of this? This seems kind of absurd, but on the face of it, kind of plausible. But or it follows logically. So where do we go from here? Now, if you'll remember, we introduced the concept of potency as the middle ground between being and non-being to refute both Parmenides and Zeno's arguments. Um, However, I really don't think I did justice to this concept in the last podcast. And so in this podcast, we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into potency before examining how it refutes the static monism of Parmenides and Zeno. Static monism is a question that is going to be asked, just warning you all. Um, if you're so, um, oof. So, so the Aristotelian and Thomist is actually in full agreement with Parmenides that something can't come from nothing. So that's actually, as I was saying earlier, it's a logically coherent thing to say. Something can't come from nothing. Yeah, we're all on board with that. But they argue that change doesn't involve a non-existent thing turning into an existent thing. It involves a middle ground between existence and non-existence, which is changed into existence or falls out of existence. And it is that is what is called potency, and that is what determines. Um, yeah, that's how you get out of the this sort of false dichotomy that Parmenides and Zeno set up, where it's only two things. It's potency. It's not nothingness coming into being. It's a real aspect of being changed, being actualized into something existent. Um, so yeah, and this is what the Aristotelian and Thomists would argue change is, that it is the actualization of potential, which sounds really fancy and confusing, I know, but actualization here just means becoming real, and actual potential here just means something that was a capacity that was latent in the thing, or a power that was latent in the thing that is now existing fully. Um, okay, let me see here. Yeah, so okay. So even here though, this seems a little vague. How can something half exist? Um, yeah, so there's definitely more to be fleshed out here in terms of potency. Um, so here's an example to maybe help illustrate this. Imagine that you're standing on the top of a hill next to a boulder, and you decide to push the boulder down this hill. Maybe you see, the Wesley and his love and Princess Bride like rolling down the hill, and you're the evil guy, and you don't care for all that rolling, so you just push the boulder down. All right, so so if you push the boulder, um, it's not the would it it's not going to fly like a kite or explode when you touch it or turn into a werewolf. Like all those crazy things are not going to happen if your action is pushing the rock. Um, so what will actually happen is that being pushed, when it's pushed, the result will be it rolls down the hill and comes to a stop somewhere beyond the hill. Um, so why does it roll down the hill instead of flying like a kite, exploding, or turning into a werewolf? Well, the answer is that it's potency, which determines the way um, in which existence behaves in the thing. So to capture um, okay. Yeah, so this is the definition of potency then. A real objective capacity for being, a real objective capacity of a thing, which determines how that thing behaves, could behave, or could have behaved. Um, yeah, so that's just saying like, if you take the boulder, let's say you hadn't pushed it, we would know already that it wouldn't fly like a kite or whatever. So it's not like it's built into the very like fabric of the thing. Like the existence of the thing informs the potency of the thing, and it's limited by that potency. But in turn, that potency can receive, if it wasn't attached to existence, it wouldn't exist. So in turn, with potency being attached to existence, potency now has a real capacity to change to go along with the existence that it now has. Um, yeah, and Yeah, so I think I covered that pretty well. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot more to act in potency than we just talked about right here, but this should suffice for defeating Parmenides and Zeno. So Parmenides' arguments that only pure actuality exists, that is just existence, and that it's impossible to distinguish objects if only pure actuality exists, fall apart because of potency. Um, and in the second place, it is because potency uh, is the way that we distinguish one object from another. So let's return back to Zeno's paradoxes here and see how they fall apart with this new concept. So in the case of the dichotomy paradox, we can say that the distance between point A and point B is only potentially infinite and not actually infinite. For example, you could travel half the distance to B from A and then half the distance again to B, but let's say if you had longer legs, you might be able to reach B in one step. Each person traveled the same amount of distance, but in the first example, the potential to go halfway from A and the potential to go from halfway to B were actualized, whereas in the second example, only the potential to go straight from A to B was actualized. So you see in that case there was different the same distance traveled, but two different potencies activated, actualized. Sorry, not activated. Um, yeah. So then in the case of Zeno's paradox of parts, we can say that those divisions of the rock are only there potentially. The boulder is still a boulder until you actually try to divide it. It's only half a boulder potentially. Like if you cut right through it, it doesn't become a half boulder until you cut right through it. Um, yeah. Okay, so hopefully I didn't go too fast for you guys, but um, here's the recap coming up. So make sure to turn your ears on because the quiz will be right after this. Um, and everything that you need to know will be right in this recap. All right. So metaphysics is the study of supersensible or the study of being isolated from being, or sorry, that's a bad definition. Let me restart there. All right. Metaphysics is the study of the supersensible or the study of being qua being as being, isolated from the rest of the thing, like the lettuce of a taco. Um, if you're a food critic. So the first metaphysicians, so people who practiced metaphysics, were Parmenides and Zeno in about the 6th to 5th century before Christ, who held that nothing existed except for being. This is a position known as static monism. So Parmenides and Zeno's position that there is only existence is called static monism. Um, and then we have Zeno, who is famous for two paradoxes trying to illustrate this point. The first one, called the Dichotomy Paradox, holds that it's impossible to go from A to B, since going from A to B requires going half the distance to B, which requires going half of half the distance to B, if you remember that one. The second one, called the Paradox of Parts, argues that since things with parts can be divided in an infinite number of ways, then all things must be of infinite size, which is absurd, thereby implying that only one being exists. Aristotle, an ancient Greek philosopher who lived in the 4th century BC, refuted Parmenides and Zeno by introducing the concept of actuality, which is the part of something in existence. Well, it's not really a part of it in existence. I should say uh, yeah, it's necessary for the existence of a thing, and potency, which is just the capacity for a certain type of change, how it limits actuality and determines where actuality goes. Um, so change in its turn is simply the actualization of potential, i.e., the bringing into being of something that had a capacity to be brought to being in that way. Finally, Aristotle's concept of potency refutes Zeno's paradoxes, since in the dichotomy paradox, the distances between A and B are there only potentially. If you remember the guy with longer legs who made it in one step and the guy with shorter legs who made it with two. And since in the paradox of parts, a thing is only potentially divisible until it is actually divided. So remember that rock. number of divisions there are only are all potent, all part of potency. Um, they aren't they aren't actual until you actually divide it in that way. Oof. All right. So we've just recapped everything from this episode. Next episode, we will be covering Heraclitus's dynamic monism, which again was mentioned in the first episode, the previous podcast, but I just want to take it really slow and go through everything a little more thoroughly. So we'll be taking a look at Heraclitus's dynamic monism and hopefully dive into even more detail on potency and act. All right, quiz time. Sweet. All right, question 1. What is metaphysics? Choose all that apply. Is it A, the study of the supersensible, B, a special branch of physics, C, a special branch of history, D, the study of being qua or as being? Let me repeat that. What is metaphysics? The study of the supersensible, A, B, a special branch of physics, C, a special branch of history, or D, the study of being qua or as being? All right. Well, I'll wait for you guys to think about it. Maybe pause the video here. All right. So coming back, we can see that from what I said above, that metaphysics is A and D. A, the study of the supersensible, and D, the study of being qua or as being. It is not a special branch of physics. It could be said that physics is rather a special branch of metaphysics, but yeah, it goes metaphysics goes down to the root. Okay, question 2. Who was or were the first metaphysicians? Choose all that apply. A, Aristotle, B, Zeno, C, Buddha, D, Parmenides. So once again, who was or were the first metaphysicians? Choose all that apply. Aristotle, A, B is Zeno, C is Buddha, D is Parmenides. All right, I'll give you some time. Pause your video. All right, so coming back, the correct answer is B and D, Parmenides and Zeno. They were the first metaphysicians, and they're the ones who had that sort of crazy idea that only being exists, and that only being exists. All right, so going on to question 3, what is static monism? A, the state your TV is in once it goes to sleep. B, the idea that everything is in constant flux, i.e., only potency exists. C, the idea that being is the only thing there is, i.e., only act exists. D, the idea that nothing exists whatsoever. Give you some time here. All right, the correct answer is C, the idea that being is the only thing there is, only act exists. All right, 4. Parmenides and Zeno believed in static monism. True or false? Give you some time. The correct answer is true. They did believe in the position of static monism. All right, question 5. Who was or were the authors of the Dichotomy Paradox and the Paradox of Parts? Choose all that apply. A, Heraclitus, B, Parmenides, C, Zeno, D, Plato. All right, the correct answer is, pause your computer, the correct answer here is Zeno, C. All right, moving on to question 6. The dichotomy paradox argues that change is impossible since the infinite amount of distance between point A and point B is infinite only potentially. So let me read that again. The dichotomy paradox argues that change is impossible since the infinite amount of distance between point A and B is infinite only. Oh crap. I totally messed up the wording of this question. That's my bad. Okay. All right. Forget everything you just heard. The dichotomy paradox argues that change is possible since the infinite amount of distance between point A and point B is infinite only potentially. True or false? The correct answer here is false, and that is because the dichotomy paradox would argue that change is impossible, not that it is possible. Aristotle would argue that that traveling from A to B is possible, but Parmenides and Zeno would hold that because of the infinite amount of space between A and B, that it would be impossible. So Zeno, being the founder of the dichotomy paradox, certainly wouldn't say that it was possible to actually move. Question 7. The paradox of parts argues that only being exists, since the only thing that can distinguish being from non-being is non-being, which can't distinguish anything since it is simply nothing. True or false? All right, this one's going to be true. Question 8. What is potency? A, the capacity for change. B, a potion. C, something powerful. D, the existence of a thing. Gave you an easy one here. All right, the correct answer is A, the capacity for change. All right, question 9. What is act? A, the capacity for change. B, a play. C, a test you have to take to get into college. Oh, that's pretty good. D, the existence of a thing. Give you some time. The correct answer is D, the existence of a thing. What is change? A, the ambiguousness of palindromes. B, the actualization of potential. C, the administration of potions. D, the potentialization of act. Give you some time here. The correct answer is B. All right, that's all the questions that there are. You could go over in your head mentally how many of them you got right. Hopefully that this helped all of you understand metaphysics, the basics of metaphysics a lot better, and hopefully I'll do a better job of explaining this in the future. All right, that will be all for the philosophy section, which has run on kind of long, and we will turn it over to the politics section. All right. Oof, give me a second here. I'm gonna take a drink of water. Throat's kind of dry. Oof. All right, good to go. All right, so this now takes us to the political portion of the podcast, which continues our read through of Plato's Republic, where we left off last time. In the coming weeks, I would like to do a special. Wait, nope, I forgot to edit that out of my notes. So I will not say that. Okay. All right. Okay. So we'll start by recapping the last episode. So in the last edition of this podcast, I said that Polemarchus and Adeimantus were arguing with Socrates in the second book. It was actually Glaucon and Adeimantus arguing. So I apologize for that slip up. Glaucon and Adeimantus were the two brothers who put up the stories about the magic ring, and I don't remember the other one, but it wasn't Polemarchus. Polemarchus was only in the first book. We've only seen him in the first book so far. All right, so if you remember the last time, the Republic starts with Socrates being invited by some youths to a house where he finds an old man, Cephalus. They strike up a conversation on old age and whether it is old age itself or people's attitude towards old age that makes it onerous. Cephalus concludes that the ability to handle old age comes from being just, and defines it loosely as the speaking of truth and paying of one's debts. This definition gets bandied around until it's finally concluded that speaking the truth and paying of debts can't be a proper definition of justice, since the harming of one's enemies and the benefiting of one's friends is a sort of thieving, since the harming of one's enemies and sorry. Let me back up there. I'm really sorry. I'm botching this. All right, this definition gets bandied around until it is finally concluded that speaking the truth and paying of debts can't be a proper definition of justice, since the harming of one's enemies and benefiting of one's friends, both is a sort of thieving and will result in the harming of one's friends and benefiting of one's enemies at least some of the time, because you don't know who your enemies or friends really are. So they're going on this side discussion, pretty peaceful and quiet, and then Thrasymachus kind of barges in and argues that everyone's had it all wrong. That justice, it really is might makes right. Socrates eventually refutes him by showing him that justice means doing the bad and injustice the good. And then after that, Thrasymachus kind of storms out. But then Glaucon and Adeimantus, not Polemarchus and Adeimantus, Glaucon and Adeimantus pick up the thread and put out some really powerful arguments against Socrates' refutation. So, in the first place, this is Glaucon and Adeimantus in the first half of Book 2. In the first place, they argue that everyone is just only because they are made to be so by the state. Hello, Hobbes. Glaucon then brings up the example of a man with a magic ring, which would make him invisible, and argues that no sane man would resist the temptation to use it, since there would be no penalty for doing so. Frodo. Excuse me. He also juxtaposes an unjust man who is given everything in life and a just man who is given nothing and is eventually killed in an extremely painful way, and argues that no one would choose the just man. And the very interesting thing about this example is it's said that Plato that actually predicts the crucifixion about 300 or 400 years prior, because some translations translate it as impaled, but it could also be translated as will be crucified. So yeah, you can just imagine having everything taken away from you, just like Christ, just like Christ did. Would you choose Christ or the wealthy man that has everything he wants? It's a good good question. So yes, okay. All right, so now we come to the place where we left off last time. So after Glaucon and Adeimantus stop speaking, they beg Socrates to take the thread, and he does so by arguing that, and this is kind of an important analogy, that looking at big letters on a rock from far away can help us read the smaller letters on a smaller rock, with the big rock referring to the definition of justice in the city, and the small rock referring to the definition of justice in the individual. In this way, Socrates, instead of answering Glaucon and Adeimantus directly, proposes to investigate the origins of the city as a means to discovering justice in the state, which in turn he hopes to turn around and discover the justice in the justice in the individual. So so I told you this analogy that he makes between these two stones is kind of important. This kind of assumption is sort of the foundation of Plato's work here. How exactly Socrates proposes to examine these in the next few books are, no matter like what he's talking about, he's gonna be talking about like rhythms, proper music to sing, stories to tell the children, all of this seemingly unrelated stuff that doesn't seem like it would tie back to justice. But remember that no matter how off topic certain things may seem to be, everything Plato's saying here, or Socrates is arguing here, is all for the purpose of establishing these two principles. That justice in the individual is analogous to justice in the city, and that observing the origin of a city is the best way to find justice in the city. So I'll go over those two again. The two foundational statements of Plato's Republic are that justice in the individual is analogous to justice in the city, and the origin of a city is the best way to find justice in the city. Okay. So, in accordance with his plan, then, as we continue through Book 2, Socrates begins his proof by arguing that cities arise because we have many needs and are not self-sufficient. This constraint requires people to specialize in the craft they are best suited for, which in turn allows everyone else in the city to specialize in what they are best suited for. Sounds like Adam Smith. Plato then makes a distinction between the healthy and the feverish city and likens the difference as a difference between the healthy and feverish individual. We should examine, and here's beginning quote, we should examine not only the birth of a city, but of a luxurious city. Yet to me, the true city is that which we described like a healthy individual. However, if you wish, let us also observe the feverish city. So, in this luxurious city, Socrates argues that there will be need for many more services to cater to the luxurious taste of its inhabitants, such as swineherds, beauty parlors, barbers, to name a few. This increase in the crafts will require upkeep that is greater than if it wasn't a luxurious city, and it will also increase the number of inhabitants, eventually forcing the city to expand and force it into declaring war on others so as to be able to uh, house and feed all of its inhabitants. Um, Besides these specialized crafts, cities also require someone learned in the craft of war. This is a position Socrates calls a guardian. So every city needs to have a guardian. Having established how a city's birth leads to its growth, Socrates now turns to discuss this position of guardian for the city. Um, So he has this example where he looks at dogs and says, "Hey, look, like dogs are really aggressive versus people they don't know, but they're really, happy around people they do know." So the only distinction there, only the only reason why they're mad at other people and not mad towards their owner is because of a difference in knowledge. They know their owner. They don't know the random guy on the street. Um, so Socrates argues that dogs love knowledge, that they are wise in that way because um, uh, because loving knowledge is analogous to loving wisdom, and he argues that the guardians must be dogs in this sense, like they must protect their city with you know uh, as much tact and stuff as they can, and they've got to be ferocious, but they've also got to be ferocious and unyielding in war. Um, okay, so turning over to the education of the guardians, how do we make them virtuous? How do we make them lovers of wisdom from the very start? Socrates argues that stories told in the city must be heavily restricted so as to properly mold children's lives. Um, oof. Socrates argues that since God is good and nothing good is harmful, and nothing harmful causes harm, and what does no harm can do no evil, that God can't be the cause of anything evil. Um, Let me go over that again. Socrates argues that since God is good, nothing good is harmful, nothing harmful causes harm, and what does no harm can do no evil, that God can't be the cause of anything evil. Thus, Socrates says all stories about God must conform to this basic tenet. Um, Additionally, Socrates argues that since God is perfectly good, any change he undergoes must necessarily be a change for the worse. Um, Therefore, because he can't change himself, he cannot deceive others or misrepresent himself. And I'm really excited to share this to you guys later on. But this concept of God not being able to change himself comes up in Plotinus, who was also a Neoplatonist in the third or fourth century AD, and he argues for the existence of God using this divine simplicity. So yeah, we'll definitely be returning to that idea. Okay. All right. So let's wrap things up here, um, and we'll do like a brief recap here because I'm a little over time. In conclusion, then, let's show how the argument presented here traces back to Socrates' assertions that justice in the individual is akin to justice in the state, and that an examination of the origins of the state should lead us to the justice in the state. Remember, those are the two principles that you got to hammer into your head. Justice of the individual is analogous to justice of the state, and justice in the city, or sorry, justice in the individual is analogous to justice in the city. Wait, sorry, let me back up. Justice in the city is analogous to justice in the individual, and the birth of a city is how we determine whether a city is just or not. So if we examine the birth of a city, then we should be able to see justice as it is growing and as it exists in that city. Um, so in this last half of book 2, which has been presented here, he's this is his attempt to prove that by laying out the origins of the city like he did, that we will now be able to see justice more clearly, and he will go on in book 3 to argue to examine justice in a little further. So in terms of the birth of the city, he argues that a city comes from a division of labor between its inhabitants who need each other since they are not self-sufficient, meaning they can't sustain themselves. There's also the feverish city, which requires even more crafts and tends to use up resources, leading to a need for war against surrounding neighbors. As protection against the enemy, then, the city needs guardians trained in the arts of war. This, in turn, requires all impious stories about the gods to be scrubbed, and only those stories which paint God as good and true to be admitted, and not deceitful. Thus we see that the city is composed of mutually dependent citizens, and not a tyranny over people not strong enough to do evil, as Thrasymachus argued. Remember, he argued that people are just only because they are made to be so. Whereas here Socrates is saying, no, they are mutually dependent on each other. They need each other. No one man is self-sufficient. So, despite this, even though he's answered Thrasymachus' objection, he still has a ways to go to address Glaucon and Adeimantus' examples of the invisible ring and the wealthy unjust man versus the poor and tortured just man. So next week we will see how he proposes to do this by examining the ideal character of guardians, and I'll end with that. So I guess homework for the politics section, see if you can remember what the two arguments central to Socrates' theory of justice are, and just mentally in your head, see if you can formulate those. If not, then try going back earlier in the video because I mentioned it quite a bit. All right, well, that will do it for politics, and I think it is now time to move on to economics. All right, give me a second here. All right, gonna drink some more water because my throat is really dry. Sorry. All right, so this is gonna be pretty fun. All right, economics, here we go. So we'll start with a brief overview of the previous economic podcast, and then we will do a general overview of economics, examining some of the changes that have shaped our world and some of the commentary concerning these changes. Wow, okay, I forgot to go back and change that. That is absolutely not what we are going to be doing. What we are going to be doing is we're going to be looking at economic history and commentators on economic history to see where, how we got to this present state right now, and how the business of economics ought to be carried out. So that means we're going, we will be looking at Adam Smith, obviously, but that means also going back and looking at like mercantilism and all of this other stuff, because we tend to think that like a lot of the financial institutions that we have right now are new with the coming of Adam Smith, but not necessarily true. Sorry, excuse me. Okay, but I will be recapping the last episode, so sorry for that slip up, but I will be doing that. So if you remember the episode last time, or if you haven't seen it, we examined the division between negative and positive economics and critiqued each for its overreach into other academic disciplines. Something that has led to a lot of confusion over what economics is. Now, if you remember, negative economics needs philosophy to justify its claims, since it is not only that its modeling for human behavior is faulty and needs a few tweaks, which it does, because it is, but rather that what negative economics defines as rational self-interest is a philosophical claim touching the very root of human behavior and not an economic claim. Um, it's not something that can be that can be quantified. It's something that we have to approach using reason. As we saw last time, there has been enormous debate over the centuries as to what principle human behavior should revolve around. You have Aristotle who says happiness, you have Kant who says duty, and now you have modern economics saying material prosperity. Like it's just all over the map. So just to stipulate that as trivially true is just pretty ridiculous. Um, okay, but let's say that somehow modern economics is correct. Like hey, we all behave like materialistic animals. Well, even if they struck that gold by chance, they would still need a philosophical backing for arguing that this actual human behavior is correct human behavior. Otherwise, it would just be an observational science like psychology. Like this is what happens. This is what happens. Um, but if it once it tries to say this ought to happen or that ought to happen, then it's treading on philosophy's toes there a little bit or a lot. So this confusion also extends into positive economics as well. Now, positive economics takes the extremely tenuous grounds of negative economics and not only agrees with negative economics' faulty view of human behavior, but also argues that this extremely faulty view of human behavior ought to be the gold standard. Like you got to act in your rational self-interest, pedal to the metal. Once again, positive economics is encroaching upon ethics turf and needs philosophical arguments to support its case since economics only focuses on what is strictly quantifiable. And you can't quantify things like virtue, things like uh, you know, like happiness, or I mean, you can kind of quantify happiness, but um, not in it's not going to give you something in the Catholic sense of what happiness means. And yeah, so just to reduce all human behavior to what is quantifiable is is the same as physics reducing metaphysics to all that is quantifiable, and saying, oh, nothing can exist outside of the quantifiable. Well, you're just begging the question against people who say that they do exist and it can. You're not actually providing an argument against it because you actually need to make a philosophical argument, not a physics argument, or a philosophical argument, not an economics argument that what you're doing is true and desirable. So I don't mean to be a downer. So we've critiqued modern economics. Where do we go from here? I don't want to just like shoot it down and say, hey, it's don't pay any attention to it. Um, is there anything we can offer in its place? I would say yes, uh, but it's definitely murky because of economics' claims to accurately represent the way in which humans actually behave and how they ought to behave. There's almost no discipline in the humanities which isn't affected by economics. In philosophy, economics begs the question against ethics and reduces human behavior to materialistic, consumerist animals, reduces our behavior to that. In psychology, it holds an outmoded and false view of how humans actually behave. Not that I'm in any way defending the way psychology is carried out today, but I'm just saying economics is encroaching upon psychology, um, which that's a whole just separate discussion. In politics, economic prosperity has become paramount, and since Adam Smith in the 18th century, since cited as the founder of economics, economics has been a pariah upon other academic disciplines, slowly sucking the lifeblood out of them all unseen and shrouded by its mysterious secret formulae. If you're not a mathematician, it's like you can't say anything because you don't know the math, um, which is kind of absurd. Okay, so be that as it may, the goal for the rest of this podcast is to sketch a working theory of how economics should work from a Catholic point of view and to introduce some authors who may be of use in that regard. To my knowledge, no one has tried to develop a working economic theory outside from a fully Catholic perspective outside of G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc with their distributism in the early 20th century. But please feel free to comment if you know of any other works that might be relevant. I'll be naming a few here in a second. So I've yet to read almost all the books I'm about to present to you. Uh, so yeah, I'm going to be learning right along with all of you guys. Um, yeah, so by working theory or like whatever working theory we have right now, it's definitely a work in progress. So yeah, I'm really excited to be able to journey with you all as we try to figure this out because yeah, I'm just taking a leap of faith right now. Um, so but before reading books, well, we have to think about what might be a good place to start. Um, well, a good place to start is we know from, or at least I argue that economics today is opposed to philosophy, psychology, and politics. So if we can examine each of these disciplines and see in what way they are related to uh, economics, we can see how economics destroy or how economics appropriates their material. So for the first one, let's look at philosophy. Um, so economics is actually a Greek word meaning household management and refers to the proper managing of the household. This definition doesn't specify in advance what the proper managing of the household is, only that there is one. You need a philosophical argument to say that, you know, for example, to say that the proper management of the household is maintaining it rather than destroying it. Like obviously we would say, well, you should maintain it, but we only know that by intuition. There's no argument that is being presented for that. You need a philosophical basis to to really prove that. Um, yeah, so the first two books, which have immediate relevance now, both of which I haven't read yet, but they probably will be the books we start off with, are Aristotle's Economics and his Nicomachean Ethics, which explore these questions in more deep detail. So Aristotle's Economics coming from the point of view of household management, and Nicomachean Ethics, which should hopefully help us see how uh, how modern economics is taking over ethics when it shouldn't be. So the second discipline we mentioned that economics is encroaching on is psychology. Now, psychology isn't exactly in good standing either, having adopted much of the materialist ideas that economics has. But nonetheless, even from an atheist materialist perspective, there is still friction between it and economics. There are some relevant works here from the psychological point of view which oppose economics' view of the human being, materialistic view of the human being, such as Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which develops a psychological theory termed logotherapy based on Viktor Frankl's observations of human behavior in concentration camps. Viktor Frankl was actually in a concentration camp for some time, and he managed to survive. And then this Man's Search for Meaning is just it's a really good book, a lot of stories from that time. There's also Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which outlines how humans tick, and Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational, which argues that we are not the rational agents economics claims we are. All right, that takes us to the third discipline mentioned which is politics. Uh, sorry. Now this one is definitely the hardest to see, um, since it depends on because our society is so materialistic. Um, and I'm going to be completely honest up front that I have little idea how to properly separate the two. But there are numerous works that should help make that division easier. So again, this is a very working theory. I've got to do some reading, and I don't just want to like speak completely off the cuff. I actually want to back up what I'm saying. So hopefully, some of these works will help us answer this question. But some of these works include Hilaire Belloc's The Servile State, G.K. Chesterton, What's Wrong with the World, The Outline of Sanity, Utopia of Usurers and Other Essays. Then we have Douglas North's The State of Economic History, Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation, Joseph Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, Ludwig von Mises' Socialism, and finally Hayek's Road to Serfdom. Some of these books include both an economic and political component, which is, again, very hard to tease apart, but I hope that we can delineate the two. So, our working theory of what economics ought to be is not really that close to being fully fleshed out, but we have the bones there in place. We know from the first podcast that economics appropriated material from philosophy, psychology, and economics, and we now have a rough sketch of the kind of materials we might need, as well as some considerations which will need to be taken into account. And hopefully, these will lead us more or less to the truth. Um, yeah, and that's about all I have in economics. I know it's a bit of a shorter video today. Uh, I know philosophy kind of stole a bunch of the airtime, but I think that's about it. So, yeah, please remember the announcements that if you want to watch, you can watch the full length podcast or you can watch the podcast split into 3 parts. And I'm also going to be sending out a form via Facebook uh, to ask for feedback, which hopefully will work this time because it didn't the first time. Um, all right, I think that's about it. Thank you all for making it this far, and hope you have a good day. God bless.